Hello and welcome to this quick little snippet, this morsel of content with me, Joe Craven, the Senior Director of English for NET. Today, this is all about pedagogy. I'm going to be focusing on modelling in English, looking at a few approaches, a few ideas about how and why it should work the way that it does. Now, understanding effective modelling really does depend on understanding the apprenticeship model, which I'm sure you'll have come across in some of your training already. Now, the apprenticeship model basically starts with the student being the apprentice, someone who doesn't know anything about what we're supposed to be doing, and they're working with the master, and the master, of course, in this metaphor is the teacher. So we start with, here's a masterpiece, and that's the finished product. Then the apprentice, the student, watches the teacher make the masterpiece, and that's about unpacking the process. Here's how it works, watch me do this. Then you have the collaborative part of the process, where you make one together. So the apprentice and the master collaboratively work through it, looking at all the routines, the processes, and so on. Then the student takes the lead, the apprentice actually makes one themselves, with advice, with guidance, possibly even with intervention from the master, and that's the guided practice part of that, building on the method collaboration. And then at the end of the process, the student makes one independently, and that's the independent practice. That's the point at which they're ready to create their own masterpiece. And of course, if it doesn't work, we go back through the process and we unpack it based on whatever stage they need to revisit. But essentially, the apprenticeship model there leads from the student being the apprentice to the student becoming a master in their own independent application of the skills. So a key consideration has got to be what makes an effective model. Now, first of all, any model has got to be accessible for the students, right? So not a teacher-speak version, not a degree level version, and sometimes it's tempting to write the best possible answer that we as adults can, missing the fact that it's got to be a model that a student could achieve themselves. So it's got to be levelled appropriately for the class. That's also true even within the range of students. For a very low ability class, they need a different model, a different level of modelling from a very, very high ability class or a very independent class. Now, model has got to fit the requirements of the task. Now, that sounds like a very obvious thing to say, but every single year I walk into classrooms and I'll see a model someone's written, which is 500 words, for example, for a 5-minute response. And that's way too much. It isn't replicable for the student. So it's got to be a model which is of the length that a student could produce in the time they've got, structured in the way the student should be writing their own response, and also of an equality that's appropriate to the time that's available. So if a student, for example, has 5 minutes to write a response, the model's got to be one they could produce in that 5 minutes, and not one that the teacher spent an hour polishing, refining, making perfect, because it isn't, again, replicable for the student. And as you can see in that third purple box, that's a key thing. It's got to be replicable for the student, something that they can aspire to achieve, work towards achieving. But it's still one that's got to be offering stretch in terms of the ZPD. So what that means is, obviously, as you all know, the zone of proximal development, we've got to be pitching it at a level where it's achievable, but requires a bit of stretch for the student. So it's pushing at the upper end of their understanding, the upper end of their ability. It's got to be aspirational. And that's about it, ensuring development and growth for the student. So, accessible, leveled appropriately, fitting the requirements of the task, and replicable, but still offering stretch at the top end for all the students to whom it's given. Now, as you can see from the purple boxes across the slide here, these are different approaches to modelling, different kinds of modelling we might want to be applying in a classroom. And I wanted to talk through some of the angles on this, some of the ways in which this can work. Now, obviously, sometimes we're going to walk into a classroom with a pre-prepared model, Blue Peter style. Here's one that I made earlier. Now, there's uses to that, of course there is. You can ensure from that it's aspirational for the students. Here's a really good version we can try and achieve ourselves and work towards. And it's that masterpiece idea we talked about earlier. Obviously, it's a way of ensuring that it's accessible, that we can still make sure that it's one pitched at the right level, and that can be useful as well. Now, 2 really good ways of using this. One is a waggle, what a good one looks like. So these can be good examples. We can glue into books. Here's what you should be working towards. Equally powerful can be a wabble, what a bad one looks like. So quite often, for example, after an exam cycle, I'll take some examples of things that haven't worked, mistakes people have made, and I will use them in lessons. Obviously for that, always anonymous, never designed to humiliate the student or to embarrass the student, never specific in terms of identifying who the student is ever, and I'd always make sure the students never even identify themselves if they recognise it. But showing what students do badly in exams and then showing what a good one should look like, it can be a really, really useful way of modelling expected style and length and quality of answer and so on. Now that can be very, very useful. I'd be very, very cautious, though, of always using these complete pre-prepared models, and we'll talk about why with the remaining 4 kinds. Now, a partially completed model can also be a very, very useful thing. So, for example, we might offer the students the opening of a response that they then need to complete, and that can be really, really useful in terms of getting over that hurdle of how do I start it, what should my first word be, and so on. It gets over that initial hurdle so they can then go on with the answer. Now, close exercise can also be a way of doing that. It can seem very, very Key Stage 2-ish, if not younger, in terms of missing out key words. But what that does mean is that it can focus very specifically on particular bits of information, particular details, the most important bits. A bad close exercise is a complete waste of time. A good close exercise simply takes away the cognitive load of having to think about all that extraneous kind of information and extraneous detail, and simply zooms in on the most important bits. And as I put in that 3rd bullet point there, it allows us to focus on specific sections, on specific things we really want them to build on. So if, for example, the class are great at doing the points on a Peel paragraph, but they struggle with integrating evidence, then we simply give them the points, and the evidence is the point they actually start at. Now, the 3rd type is, of course, the guided or collaborative model, which is recorded in books. Now, this is one, again, to be a little bit cautious about. It's really, really useful, of course, to show the teacher mastery of it. Watch me work. And early in the process, that can be a very, very powerful thing. It's a way of ensuring, of course, we get good practice in their books, that students see how the process works, and they therefore have it in their books as well as a model to refer back to. The danger is, of course, if that's all they ever receive, then all that they are recording in their books is proof that their teacher can do it, and not that they themselves can do it. So although early on in a process we may want to do that kind of that guided collaborative model that they then write down, we then need to shift across to them becoming independent in that process. And that's that movement across from following the master to actually the independent or partially independent production of the responses themselves. Now, a way of building from that is, of course, to look at the live modelling, which is then removed from the whiteboard. And this is a more nuanced approach to the previous idea of the guided or collaborative model they record in their books. In this version, what then happens is the teacher models on the screen or on the whiteboard, the way that it works, and they build a response. They draw on ideas from the class. They still demonstrate their mastery, of course. They work through the process with the students, that structured questioning and so on. Now, what you then say is, at the end of this process, I'm going to rub it off the whiteboard and you're going to write that paragraph. And what that means is that students still need to actively engage, not just with what is being produced, but how it's being produced. They've got to understand the process. They've got to understand the content themselves. They're still part of the collaborative process, but at the end of it, you also get that bridge into the more independent application of it. And you can also ensure that there's that visual prompt on the whiteboard first. They see it written in front of them. They see what it should look like. Then it disappears, and they've got to write it themselves. And that can be a way of building from that guided collaborative model into the more independent. Beyond that also, we then get the verbal modelling. Now, where students have become confident with it to an extent, what we then do is we get away from the written version on the whiteboard to the teacher simply modelling the thinking process, still demonstrating the mastery, still demonstrating the process as to how the structure works, still getting the active engagement from students because they're going to have to replicate it themselves and produce it themselves. But then what students need to actually focus on is that cognitive replication and that cognitive retrieval of the process. It's more discursive, it's more engaging, and we move away from it to them becoming independent themselves. So what we do is, in terms of this broader process to draw it together, we might start with an effective pre-prepared model. Here we go. Possibly some bad examples as well, negative models not to follow. Then a partial model. Here we go, here's a start, you continue. Then a guided or collaborative model, let's work it through together, right? And you can write it in your books as well. Then a live model, but not on the whiteboard, you now have to reproduce it yourself. And then not a written model, simply a verbal model of the process, the students then model themselves, and at the end of that, modelling exhausted, now become independent, off you go, you are the master. And in a sense, what we have there is that apprenticeship model followed through to its logical conclusion where the student becomes the master. If, of course, at the end of it there's an assessment in which the student doesn't produce a piece of work that's as good as it should be, we then go back to whichever stage we need to within that process. And again, that's part of the apprenticeship model being built in. Right, so hopefully that's been useful, a bit of food for thought, hopefully reassuring, if nothing else, in terms of you are doing the right things with your students, as I'm sure you will be. Thank you very much for your time, thank you for your patience, and I will see you soon.